Anti-slavery addresses when the British were still policing the anti-slave trade on the high seas in 1840 to the Anti-Slavery League in London. All of this was addressed 200 years ago. And today, unfortunately, there's a kind of new type of malcontent.
Douglas Murray absolutely dismantles a woke lawyer on live TV. If you haven't seen it yet, you are in for a treat.
Even this day of patriotic celebration in the States has become divisive. There's a growing trend for black Americans to celebrate Juneteenth as an alternative to July 4th. Veteran Congresswoman Maxine Waters in 2021 claimed the Declaration of Independence wasn't for equality and it was only for white men. Her comments were echoed by her fellow Democrat Cori Bush, who said black people still aren't free. So is there something in all this? Should these national institutions and occasions be opportunities for reflection and apology rather than celebration? Well,
think of it like this. It's the 4th of July, a day Americans celebrate their independence with hot dogs, fireworks, and patriotism. But, as always, there's a twist these days, with some people choosing to focus on historical grievances instead of the celebration. Cue Douglas Murray, the best-selling author of The War on the West, who joined a panel to discuss this very topic.
That's right. It's a very strange act of masochism, really, and an act of masochism carried out by people who don't seem to know anything. I mean, people talk about the British monarchy having to apologize for slavery. It was King George III who signed the Anti-Slavery Act into law in 1807.
Douglas Murray started off by addressing the growing trend of constantly apologizing for past wrongs, especially related to slavery and colonialism.
Who just decides that none of this happened. Usually it's because they don't know it happened. And as a result, they look at our history and everything in our country, right up to just, innocent pastimes like cricket.
He argued that this endless cycle of apologies is a bizarre act of masochism, driven by people who often don't know their history.
And they decide to name everything as guilty. And, you could do this to everyone and to everything, but most civilizations and cultures don't behave like this because most of them aren't just masochistic and so self-hating.
All right.
Murray pointed out that the British monarchy, often criticized, actually took significant steps to end slavery. King George III signed the Anti-Slavery Act into law in 1807, and Prince Albert gave a powerful anti-slavery address in 1840. But today, some individuals seem to ignore these facts and instead focus solely on guilt and blame.
On current slavery, where it exists around the world, it doesn't really make any difference to institutional racism, as we've seen in certain parts of society. I don't know what difference it makes. It might make people feel a bit better to see a royal grovelling, but so what?
See, I don't agree with you, surprise, surprise. I do think it makes a difference.
One of the most powerful points Murray made was about how modern white people shouldn't be held accountable for the sins of their ancestors. He stated, "White people living today have nothing to do with slavery. That's just a fact." He emphasized that young white men apologizing for slavery, something they had no part in, makes no sense. If someone wants to apologize out of kindness, fine, but it shouldn't be an expectation.
The problem is we've forgotten how to be genuinely proud of our great countries, both America and United Kingdom, two of the greatest countries in the world. It's almost like every day now, somebody somewhere, normally on the left, the woke left, is queuing up to find a reason to hate the countries and their histories.
Well, it's a kind of grievance competition. Your guest earlier just tried to engage in it. I don't know what hurt she believes she's had from...
Murray brilliantly highlighted how this obsession with apologies is pushed by the woke left. Instead of focusing on real issues like homelessness, crime, and drug problems, we're stuck on these minor issues that do little to solve our current challenges.
Had from slavery. All of this was addressed 2 centuries ago. Everything has consequences. All history has consequences and ramifications. But, if we were to play this fairly, we would at least look at all of the countries around the world that engaged in the slave trade who are simply not interested in any...
This frustration could be sensed. And honestly, it's a sentiment shared by many of us who are tired of this constant self-flagellation.
Empire. All the Arab countries who not just traded far more slaves than across the Atlantic, but castrated all the men so that there wouldn't be any more African slaves after them. They worked them to the bone. I see no interest across Africa in paying reparations for selling their brother and sister Africans into slavery or for
When the woke lawyer, Paula Ron Adrian, responded, she agreed that knowing history is important, but insisted that apologies and acknowledgments from those in power are crucial for healing. But Murray wasn't having it. He asked, "Whose pain and hurt are you talking about?" It's not people living today. These crimes happened hundreds of years ago. He argued that this obsession with the past distracts from current issues and doesn't help anyone move forward.
Slavery or for working them to the bone to the present day. There is slavery across Africa today. In fact, there are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So some of us are simply a bit bored of hearing people ripping at closed wounds and then crying about their hurt or their presumed hurt. Because everybody could do this. 1 million Europeans were stolen by North Africans over the course of decades of the North African Barbary pirate slave trade.
Murray also pointed out the hypocrisy in how we handle historical grievances. He noted that countries like those in the Middle East or Africa, which also participated in the slave trade, aren't held to the same standards of apology and reparation. He said, "There are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade." Why isn't there a similar outcry or demand for apologies from these regions? It's a valid question that often gets overlooked in these discussions.
Where would you end if you did that? The answer is you couldn't end, because nobody is alive who has actually suffered the hurt, and nobody is alive who did the wrong. And I'd make one other point, if I may. It's always the countries that people want to come to who are put through this struggle session. Britain, like America and France, are the most desired destinations for migrants worldwide and have been for centuries. Why is that? It's not because we're racist, it's because we're better. It's because we're good. It's because when we see racism, we actually call it out and recognize it as a sin. Try finding that across Africa.
Douglas Murray's speech was a masterclass in how to handle woke arguments. He called out the selective outrage and emphasized that modern societies, especially in the West, are the ones striving to right past wrongs. Yet, they are often painted as the worst offenders. It is a twisted narrative that needs to be challenged. One of my favorite parts was when Murray highlighted that countries like Britain, America, and France are among the most desired destinations for migrants. Why? Because they are not the racist hellholes that the woke left paints them to be. Instead, they are places that have made significant strides in combating racism and promoting equality.
Across the Middle East or in China, nobody would hear. So what we have is a situation where the more virtuous countries are presented as the worst countries. It's sick, and most of us are tired of it.
Thank you, Douglas.
I am so sorry that Douglas is bored by.
By the end of Murray's speech, it was clear he had left the woke lawyer and many others on the panel speechless. His arguments were not only logical, but grounded in historical fact and a desire to move forward rather than being stuck in a perpetual cycle of blame and guilt. Douglas Murray's takedown of the woke lawyer was a breath of fresh air. It was a reminder that while it is important to acknowledge history, we shouldn't let it define our present or dictate our actions in ways that hinder progress. It's time to focus on real issues and stop this endless cycle of masochism that does nothing but divide us further. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.